Hello and good afternoon from New York City. My name is George Heslin and I serve as Executive Director here at New York Irish Centre. On behalf of the Board of Directors at the Centre, I would like to welcome you to the inaugural American Ireland Youth Conference 2022. For 17 years, the New York Irish Centre has shared its interdisciplinary programmes with the Irish community and beyond. And each year we welcome 20,000 guests to our centre, which is located one stop from Grand Central Station here in New York. As we embark on the inaugural American Ireland Youth Conference, it gives me great pleasure to thank my colleagues Ryan McNally, Hannah Cecil and Stephen Long, who have planned every detail of this three-day event. I would like to welcome and thank participants from 11 colleges and universities across Ireland and the United States. As we emerge from the pandemic, it is even more important that we continue and indeed rebuild the transatlantic conversations that exist between our two great nations. The American Ireland Youth Conference was created to inspire, connect, challenge, unite, engage the next generation of entrepreneurs, thinkers and global leaders. The topics we have chosen to discuss, gender violence, peace and global warming, are crucial, urgent matters of our time. I would like to thank our distinguished moderators, Nisha Varia, Sarah Crowe and Claire Byrne, who have worked with some of the most important agencies across the globe tackling these issues daily, including Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, UNICEF, UNESCO and the Green Party Ireland. I would like to thank our media partners, irishcentral.com. We are deeply grateful for the support of the Irish Government and the Department of Foreign Affairs Immigrant Services Programme and the Northern Ireland Bureau, both of whom we thank for supporting and indeed believing in the vision and hope for this annual conference. I invite you to dive into this exhilarating three-day event. In closing, I would like to welcome Consul General of Ireland, New York, Helena Nolan. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Good morning and welcome everyone participating in this inaugural America-Ireland Youth Conference, Ireland Today 2022. I'm Helena Nolan, Ireland's Consul General here in New York, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. I've been reading about your programme and I'm struck by the careful thought that has gone into the selection of these topics and issues. Tackling climate change together, understanding conflict and peacemaking efforts, and identifying the causes of gender-based violence. None of these challenges are going to be solved easily or quickly. Only by listening to all perspectives and by sharing best practices will we approach effective responses. And that's where your discussions come in. You're gathered for this conference because of your exceptional expertise and insights. As advocates, researchers and strategists, you're all undertaking important work to identify and promote effective solutions to these problems. This conference offers the hope of synergy, the potential to multiply the impact of your efforts by sharing your experiences and perspectives and by learning from one another. It's also about bringing people together to make connections that will endure well beyond this conference. As our Minister Coveney wrote in his letter of support, these relationships can form the basis for lasting friendships and partnerships between Ireland and the United States for years to come. We count on you as young leaders to build on the Ireland-US partnership as it enters a new phase. That in itself is a valuable and worthy goal, and we count on you to help us to make that a reality. I'd like to acknowledge George Heslin's vision in convening this event and Ryan McNally's work as conference producer. And I want to wish you all the best of luck in your efforts this weekend and to thank everyone involved in making this important inaugural conference a reality. Gwen Sult, Asana Coid, Specialta.
Hello everyone. The Northern Ireland Bureau is delighted to be supporting this inaugural America-Ireland Youth Conference, which is looking at a whole range of really pertinent issues for the young people of today that will affect the future of our planet. It's great that both the North and the South of Ireland are working together on this initiative with American universities, and I would like to pay tribute to George Heslin and the Irish Centre in New York for the particular effort and energy that has gone into the development of this new initiative. I wish you all very well, and I look forward very much to hearing the results of your deliberations. Have a great day. Bye.
Hello and welcome to Day 2 of the American Ireland Youth Conference 2022. Today's topic is Shifting Landscapes, the Value of Peace. Before we hear from our panellists, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Today's moderator is a writer, strategist, journalist, and senior advisor and consultant for UN communications. In 2022, she helped craft a major UNESCO global report on the impact of COVID on the cultural sector. She previously led and convened the UNICEF Office of Research in Florence, where she moderated and organized the Leading Minds Conference. She's also worked for UNICEF as the Chief of Crisis Communications. I'd like to welcome today's moderator, Ms. Sarah Crowe.
Thank you, George. Hello and welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this important conversation in which we will be interrogating the value of peace at a time when we thought wars in Europe were over. The war in Ukraine rages and many others smolder on in forgotten corners. The panelists today are joining us from all over the world, from Bethlehem to Belfast, New York to Washington, and I'm here in Florence, Italy. You can see all the panelists up there on the screen in front of you, so welcome. The panelists today will be asked, can you fight for peace while waging war? If we view other conflicts such as Palestine, Yemen, the Horn of Africa, through the lens of the Northern Irish peace process, the Irish peace process, can we find inspiration there? Or indeed, can there ever be peace without justice, without seeking the truth, as was attempted in South Africa? But let's start first with a personal perspective from each of the panelists. So I'm going to ask each one of you to briefly introduce yourselves and just as briefly, tell us how this subject, particularly your own individual pursuit of peace through your studies and your careers, has helped shape your lives and the lives of others. I'm going to go in this order, first of all from Dr. Brendan Brown, who is in Bethlehem, then on to Casey Donoghue, Sarah Nangela, Owen Cummings, and then finally Ryan Connor. Over to you, Brendan.
Well, first of all, Garamila Mulgad for having me on to this panel. My name's Dr. Brendan Kieran Brown. I'm an assistant professor of conflict resolution at Trinity College in Dublin. My work focuses on issues of colonial violence, specifically focused on Palestine and the north of Ireland. I was born and I was bred in Belfast City. I was born at a time of uncertainty and great rupture in the north of Ireland. Like everybody in the space, I've had family experiences of conflict. My father was an internally displaced person, burnt out of his home in the mid-1970s, my mother too. And I've dedicated my entire academic career since 2009, living and working in Palestine as an ally, engaging in a swathe of projects that include seeking ways to expose Western liberal peace-building interventions that have utterly failed. And I'm also involved in a number of youth groups in Belfast as well. So I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Brendan. And your thoughts on how your pursuit of peace has helped change the lives of others, do you think?
Well, that's something for the obituary, maybe in the future. I'm committed very much to enhancing and improving the lives of lots of people who've grown up in Belfast. I play a role with some youth organisations that bring Catholics and Protestants across the divide in the north of Ireland. And I've also seen the way that those projects have been manipulated and misused when they have been brought into other contexts, like in Palestine, where it's a process of normalization and is utterly destructive. So I feel very uniquely positioned to be able to comment, being from Belfast and spending, the best part of 12 years in Palestine.
Thank you, Brendan. Casey Donoghue, you're not ready for your obituary yet, I hope, but your thoughts on how you position yourself in this space and your studies.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you. I'll begin by echoing Brendan's gratitude about being here. Just to everyone on the panel, I'm thrilled to be learning from you all today. And Sarah, to be fielding questions from someone like yourself with the support of New York Irish Center is just, it's very humbling. But to me, my name is Casey Donoghue. Greetings from Washington, D.C. I am a master's candidate in both history and foreign service at Georgetown. And I'll collect those degrees in about 3 hours, after which I'll just be an unemployed DC resident. But my research will be ongoing, and it kind of revolves around One question, which is, how do nations explain themselves to their kids? In Liberia, Northern Ireland, and the United States, three seemingly very different Atlantic nations, I'm looking at different trajectories of how the civil conflicts in those nations are being remembered. And I have to say, I fell into this, or at least started asking the preludes to these questions about 5 or 6 years ago, when I got my first experience as a youth tutor and classroom teacher. I think that it's very easy to study large historical narratives when spoken by political elites as justifiers of ongoing systems of power. But when you look at that from the classroom level, you start to approach these narratives and these stories as formative drivers of youth attitudes and behaviors. So I came at this, and I'll try to keep coming at this topic from a standpoint of, we care about our kids, so let's figure out what we're feeding them, and let's do so in good faith. And that's me.
Thank you, Casey. Sarah and Angela, please tell us your thoughts about what brought you into this field.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. So I am Sarah Nanjala. I am originally from Kenya, but currently based here in the United States. I am a Master of Global Affairs fellow at the University of Notre Dame, specializing in international peace studies. And I'm also a political affairs intern with the United Nations Peace Building Commission in New York. Prior to my master's, I was a journalist in Kenya, where I reported on various issues, among them election-related or political violence. And right now, as a researcher, I am particularly interested in the relationship between peace and development, and how peace agreements can be critical tools in preventing and as well as tackling deep-rooted conflicts, causes of conflict. And the subject of peace has been increasingly important to me, more so as its fragility continues to grow. Looking at the world right now, it's quite obvious that we are seeing there's so much conflict going on, from ethnic tensions like in Kenya, and gun violence in some other parts of the US and even around the world. And we see insurgencies and even full-out wars. And so it is without a doubt that global peace is becoming endangered. And it is because of this that I feel kind of motivated to having this desire of not only having a meaningful, but also a direct impact in preventing conflict, starting with my home country, Kenya, and also across the Africa region and across the world. So I do hope the conversations we'll have today will kind of build on into this impact. And so I'm very excited for this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And we'll pick up on some of those issues on the Horn of Africa and Kenya in particular. Moving now to Belfast, to Owen Cummings. Owen, please introduce yourself and tell us what drew you to this field.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. And I'm really looking forward to this panel today. And thank you, of course, to the New York Irish Centre for putting this on. And thank you for everyone being here as well. My name is Owen Cummings. I am the president and founder of the Queen's University Belfast Politics Society. Since November of last year, I'm an undergraduate student studying politics in my second year, hopefully going on to third. I was born in 2002, 4 years obviously after the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. And it really is no exaggeration to say that has shaped every single facet of my life. From whenever I was no age at all, I would hear my family, my teachers, people just across society telling me about the violent terror that was the Troubles. And that really, really has shown me the value of peace as a young person, and particularly in recent years, as president of the Politics Society, being able to talk to young people from such a broad spectrum of backgrounds and seeing what peace means to them. So I'm really, really excited to be here today to talk about this and hopefully bring the perspective of young people specifically from Northern Ireland who perhaps more than anyone else in the world understand how fragile peace can be and how we have to get there as young people.
Thank you, Owen. That lived experience is really so vital to this kind of work, isn't it? Final words then from Ryan Connor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, to the other panelists, and also to the New York Irish Centre for inviting us all here today. It's an excellent provocative question that you pose. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University. I write about Northern Ireland's history and politics especially from the 1960s and 1970s around the years of the civil rights movement and Bloody Sunday. I've also worked this spring with the Washington Ireland program, which engages young people across Ireland, North and South, in creating a peaceful and prosperous future. But I do also recognize that my own personal contribution to peace on the island is limited. I live on this side of the Atlantic, after all. I've been here my entire life. But on reflection, living here in the United States, I do also recognize a particular responsibility in that through my writing, we've seen the dangers of political radicalization in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, we are now seeing it here in the United States. And if even only a few Americans take my writing and use it in service of peace and justice in their own communities, then my work will have been worth it.
Thank you, Ryan. And indeed, that is, of course, global, not exclusively any one country at all, is it? Let's go back now. So thank you all for that. I'm going to go back now to to Brendan Kieran Brown. Brendan, you mentioned at the beginning there when you introduced yourself that, the comparisons are often odious, and you've highlighted this in your research as well, that no two peace processes are exactly the same. They're not like some IKEA pack of furniture that you can simply unfold and replicate elsewhere. Yet there are some lessons, aren't there, that can be adapted, some lessons for young people on how they can cope with war, what tools they can rely on to get through the very worst of times. Heard already from Owen, who was shaped by living in Belfast, and many others where you are in Bethlehem as well would have gone through that very experience. So you've documented the use of diaries, for example, and what do you think stands out for you and your research from whether it's Palestine or Northern Ireland? And is there anything that could provide, let's say, inspiration for Ukraine at the moment, where so many people seem to have been thrown into war in pursuit of peace? I have to apologize for the helicopters above, but that's what happens when you do live television. Brendan, if you could give us your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, there's lots in there, Sarah, to unpack. And if you sort of bear with me, if you sort of allow me a little bit of space to do that, I think there's a couple of things there. First of all, you're absolutely right to spotlight no two processes are the same. And I've spent a lot of time looking at ways that, dare I say it, peace processes are weaponized. And I think in many ways, our experience in the north of Ireland has been exported in a way that's really quite problematic to other spaces. And I'll not go into too much detail on that specifically. But I also want to highlight something that kind of irks me a little bit is no two experiences are the same, but the way that the West responds to conflict is grossly different in different realities. So, I mean, I'm sure I'm talking to very intelligent people here, but the response to the Ukraine situation is completely jarring when you think about what has been happening in Palestine since 1948 and before, since what's been going on in Yemen for the last, 8-10 years, Syria, what's going on in Congo. What we need to ask ourselves these very critical questions. Why is it that some lives are more grievable than others? And I think that's an extremely prescient question that we need to sit with and be uncomfortable with. I'm sure your audience here will have seen, it went viral on Twitter the other day that George W. Bush was able to confuse Ukraine and Iraq. And what I found more disturbing was not the fact that he was able to do that, was the laughter of the audience as he did that. That gave me real deep concern. So when my entire work is looking at the hypocrisy of peace building, right? And it's looking at different things. Now, I know you want me to focus on children and coping and mechanisms like that. And I understand that. And of course, in Northern Ireland, I was the beneficiary of going on trips where little Catholic school children would go away with little Protestant school children, and why can't you all just get along? But at that time, we didn't have the same structural equality, the same human rights legislation. We didn't have the same rights base, so it was always destined to fail anyway. And so when you export that model of peace building into Palestine, when you have one people that are being completely oppressed, being wiped out and erased, I mean, you saw what happened recently, I'm sure, with Shireen Abu Akleh, who was murdered whilst covering a story in Jenin. You know, this is completely nonsense. So there are tools that young people can do for coping and well-being, but the best tool we can give young people is calling out the hypocrisy of our governments and of our standards that we hold ourselves to. I'm sure there's not a direct answer to your question there, but hopefully there is something in that we can stimulate a bit of debate around.
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, you're right to call out these hypocrisies and contradictions, but very often it's just the speed at which something happens, where we've seen in a matter of weeks, 2/3 of Ukrainian children, a statistic from UNICEF, for instance, have become refugees in their own country, whereas a lot of these other issues are intractable, such as Northern Ireland. So I could turn now to Owen Cummings. And Owen, you said earlier that you were born, after the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. So the Troubles must seem like another country to you. And yet you've seen the benefits, the massive dividends from peace for your generation. And now post-Brexit, it may even lead to a united Ireland. Who would have thought? It seems, almost unthinkable not so long ago. So what is the sense right now among young people in Northern Ireland, not only what Brendan was saying about this kind of, 2-3 class system of wars, of refugees, of suffering, but what they feel about where their situation is going now, how it's unraveling. Does it feel like a new chapter, that it could be a beacon for peace, for other conflicts? Owen.
I think it's a really, really interesting question. Obviously, Northern Ireland had an election recently, which for the first time saw a nationalist party in the position to nominate for a First Minister, which is hugely significant. And it does, I think, for people on the ground, feel as though something in the air has changed. But I think as well, when looking at the issue of peace, young people here overwhelmingly support peace. It has, like you said, given us massive dividends. We've seen, the two communities here have a lot of equality now. Educational opportunities have absolutely soared. But it's also very important, I think, to note as well that the Good Friday Agreement, it wasn't a peace moment. It was the beginning of the peace process. And a lot of young people, I think, feel as though that process has stalled since whenever I was born, really. In that sort of time period, you can look at issues such as an Irish Language Act that was agreed in 1998. It was agreed subsequently in Stormont House agreements and New Decade New Approach most recently. And today you saw Andrew Jarrett march through the middle of Belfast, and they want an Irish Language Act between 17,000 and 20,000 people. So there's a lot of young people there as well. And it's clear that young people, they want the peace process to continue. And in recent years, particularly as you said, post-Brexit, it does feel as though violence is threatening to re-encroach. We saw the death of the journalist Laura McKee in the city of Derry. We saw in the last election there, candidates being intimidated out of areas, posters being burnt. And I think most notably as well, paramilitaries haven't gone away in Northern Ireland. There's dissident Republican groups. The UVF is still very much so alive. And people are really trying to crack down on that now. But it is about getting into the communities and accessing those young people, because people are trying to get the younger generation to feed into those ideas of violence, which is really the startling thing, because we could be the generation to stop it and to not partake in that. But whenever we look at polling and things like that as well, people are going to the middle ground, but they want the conversation around a united Ireland. They want a conversation about what the union is. So I think that is the very interesting thing of, people are willing to discuss these things now in a peaceful manner. And particularly amongst young people. So it will be very interesting to see where that brings us, but only time will tell. We'll have to wait until there's an executive, until things in the Republic start to maybe take shape a bit more. But I think that people are definitely ready for that conversation.
Are you saying there isn't yet a conversation about unity, about a united Ireland?
I think the sort of feeling is that people aren't having the conversation about what it will look like yet. So far, we've seen conversations around will it happen, will it not? But no one's talked about what it will look like. There was a poll in November of last year by Lord Ashcroft polls, which put 49% of people wanting to stay in the Union and 41% of people wanting to join a United Ireland. And while, of course, that does sound like a strong majority for people who want to stay in the Union, when you think about the fact that 41% of people would be willing to abandon something when they haven't had the conversation about what it is you're going to move to next, it really is quite startling to think, where will the undecided voters who at the end of the day will decide it? Where are they going to go? And again, we've seen the growth of alliance in the North, the group which doesn't take a stance on the constitutional question. So it's those voters, and whenever that discussion takes place, we've seen groups like the SDLP, like Sinn Féin, saying that we need to have a discussion amongst, unionists, nationalists, and undecided about what that's going to look like. So I think that's something we will see in the coming years. Maybe a citizens' assembly, I know, has been floated down south in order to see what that would maybe look like. So I think that the conversation's there. It's been around forever, obviously, but since peace, it's been able to flourish in a more constructive manner. And in the coming years, we're going to see if that's able to transform into something politically feasible.
A citizens' coalition would certainly be something interesting to explore, and indeed parts of it to export, let's say. So let's leave Northern Ireland for the moment. We're going to come back to the issue of dairy, Owen, that you mentioned, and I'm going to pick that up with Ryan and Casey in a bit. But for now, let's move to Africa and look at some of the common threads between different global conflicts and different approaches to peace building. Sarah and Angela, you mentioned early that you were a journalist working with the Daily Nation, and you've covered areas of violence, or in areas that are prone to violence, that have smoldered ever since Kenya endured the bloody election of 2007, I believe it was. Now with new elections looming just in a few weeks, what have young people, do you think, learnt from that peace process that was so painful and so protracted, maybe not as protracted as Northern Ireland, but all the same? Is it now being used in some way to prepare for the elections, or indeed for other conflicts in the Horn? Sarah?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And just to answer it, I'll come from like a broader perspective to a specific one touching on Kenya. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of lessons that the youth can learn about peace processes, especially from countries that have emerged from conflict or tend to have conflict. So just going on a broad angle here, over the past decade or so, there's been a growing recognition that the youth are among the ones who are affected by conflict. They are either both as the perpetrators of conflict, or they are also victims of the conflict. So one way or the other, the youth do take part majorly in conflict, regardless of the situation. And in fact, a report by Mercy Crowe shows that the youth who are involved in this conflict are usually motivated by certain factors in the country. So it could be like injustices, perceptions of injustices, or frustrations of economic and social nature, such as unemployment and inequalities. However, while the youth can be susceptible to this violence and engaging in violence, they can also be very pivotal in peace building, and they have a crucial role in it. Mostly is because they have a first-hand knowledge of conflict because of the experiences that they've had. And this gives them like a clearer understanding of, the negative effects of conflict and also what they envision for their future. And so now looking at the Kenyan context, when we've been having these various waves of conflict that are usually associated with election period or politics, it's heavily tied to deep ethnic divisions in the country. So people vote along tribal lines or ethnicity. And even the 2007, 2008 post-election violence was like more of a culmination or the peak of these ethnic tensions that was fueled by politics. And this has been something recurring ever since independence, where there's like some bouts of conflict every election cycle, with some cycles becoming very high conflict and others less so. And so when Kenya signed the National Accord in 2008, it was called the Kenyan National Dialogue on Reconciliation. It was more of like a rallying call for the youth to be involved directly in their future politically. And we see this right now with the youth being involved in activism relating to peace. They can use certain tools such as art and representation, just to try to condone violence and try to encourage each other not to participate in violence. And more recently, in the past couple of years, there's been this wave by the youth to sort of dissociate themselves from tribal politics and embracing this banner of tribeless youth, where they don't identify with their tribe, but they identify themselves as Kenyans first, instead of all these divisions that they have along ethnicity. And this initiative started in 2016, and it basically utilizes the power of the youth to promoting peaceful coexistence among the youth and within the country itself. And it also breaks down these ideologies of my tribe, my people, which people usually have this kind of perception, especially during elections. And so this kind of initiative was tied to the constitution, in which it promotes and it focuses on things like governance, social justice, accountability, inclusion. And this all can stem out from that peace agreement that I talked about in 2008, where people are trying to come together to try to deal with the issues by including more people, including the youth within national dialogues. And so this is some of the ways that the youth can participate or can engage in preventing conflict within the country. And this is something we are seeing even right now in an election year as this year, where the youth are kind of using their position and their either their talents or their connections and influence to try to prevent conflict. And I feel like it's very efficient, specifically when you think about like majority of voters in Kenya and majority of the population in Kenya are the youth. So this just shows that the youth have like a very, like their strength is very, very pivotal, like because they make a very huge percentage of the electorate. So if a majority of the youth then shy away from this election kind of perception of ethnicities and whatnot, then we can be able to move on ahead towards peace in the country. And so that is some of the things that the youth are currently doing right now in Kenya, and it comes from the lessons that we learned from previous election cycles where there have been conflict.
Sarah, briefly, as a journalist, what role are the media playing? You heard at the beginning, Brendan Brown made mention of colonialism. Is that part of the legacy of colonialism, this sense of tribalized politics? Are the media trying to reconcile these divisions?
Yes, and this particularly also stems from the 2007 post-election violence, because at that time the media, at least some media, were like highlighted as culprits who kind of fueled the conflict by how they reported, or how, especially those in vernacular languages, they kind of incited the violence in 2007, which then led to like a whole bunch of death. I think it was like over 1,500 people who died and displacement. So the media at that point they kind of realize that they need to be more careful of how they report issues, especially during political seasons. And right now we're seeing the media is kind of being accountable to itself and also holding politicians and kind of having conversations within the national scope in trying to remind people that, you know, it's because of these ethnic tensions that we kind of have this violence going on. And there's like more open dialogues within the media. There's an acknowledgement that the journalists themselves can, you know, either, depending on how they report, they can either fuel the conflict or can prevent the conflict. And the focus has also been like in training journalists to be able to avoid certain language that they use, or in like how they report, in being able to prevent conflict and trying to ensure this like peaceful election period. And it has been effective so far.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to turn now to the connection with reconciliation. In South Africa, there was, of course, a truth and reconciliation process, which was built on commissions from the dirty wars in Latin America. It was a flawed process. I covered it myself. I was there at the time. And one wonders to what extent there are indeed lessons there for Northern Ireland, for Palestine, elsewhere. I know Dr. Brown doesn't like these sorts of comparisons, but turning to Ryan Connor, who's done specific work, as we heard earlier from Owen Cummings, on dairy being still very much a smouldering issue. Is there something that Northern Ireland can take from that process to build peace among a young generation? Will the truth come out in the end during this amnesty process, during this new phase, this new chapter, through your work, Ryan Connor, through the studies on the legacies and the history of the civil rights movement in Derry? What have you learned from that process, Ryan Connor?
On the note of truth and reconciliation, I think a good place to start is to provide a brief overview of where things are, where the UK government is on justice and legacy issues. Events have been unfolding quickly, especially this past week. So I'll start with a brief overview of where things are, and then go into some examples from my own research to demonstrate some of the problems with the government's approach. So to start things off, unlike other peace agreements, the Good Friday Agreement did not provide for a truth recovery or a transitional justice mechanism. There have been a series of negotiated agreements since 1998, building on the GFA. And the one in 2014, the Stormont House Agreement, was the first to provide any provision for some sort of truth recovery or transitional justice mechanism. For example, it set up two bodies, a historical investigations unit and an independent commission for information retrieval. The first was designed to support police investigations without political interference into Troubles-related crimes. And the second was designed to enable families, victims, survivors to learn as much as possible about their particular cases. In 2020, the UK government committed to introducing legislation to implement these provisions within 100 days of the signing of the 2020 New Decade, New Approach agreement that Owen mentioned earlier. However, according to the Committee on the Administration of Justice, a non-sectarian organization based in Northern Ireland, the UK Secretary of State for Northern Ireland proceeded to create a single information recovery body rather than the multiple such bodies outlined in the SHA, thereby abandoning the SHA in favor of more of a fast-track information recovery approach that ultimately would shield members of the British security forces from prosecution for their involvement in Troubles-related crimes. Just last year, the government proposed to place a statute of limitations on all police and judicial inquests into Troubles-related crimes. This proposal received opposition from all political parties in Northern Ireland. None of them were consulted. And the idea amounted to a blanket amnesty for all ex-combatants while preventing the families of victims and survivors from learning what happened and why in each of those cases. Again, a central theme of the Stormont House Agreement. This past week, as I mentioned earlier, these events continue to unfold. The UK government introduced new legislation modifying this proposal from last year. It now creates what's called an independent commission for reconciliation and information recovery. The idea is that if ex-combatants come forward to the commission, give full accounts, then they would receive protection from civil and criminal action. Conversely, those that do not go forward would remain subject to prosecution. In effect, it offers a conditional amnesty rather than a blanket one. I think another extremely important yet overlooked part of the UK government's approach to legacy cases, especially as it relates to my work on the civil rights movement and Bloody Sunday, is the proposal to commission an official history of the Troubles written by a panel of professional historians. So take, for example, the case of Bloody Sunday and the official government inquiries into that. For decades, the official story from the first Widgery inquiry was that the soldiers fired on the civil rights marchers in self-defense. Those that organized the march, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, were responsible supposedly for the violence because it organized the march in the first place. Yet the families of the dead and injured, as well as international human rights advocates, challenged this idea from the start. After starting the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign in 1992, they effectively pressed the British government into opening a second inquiry starting in 1998. The families demanded that the government recognize their relatives as innocent and that the army was responsible for those deaths in January 1972. The second inquiry concluded as much when it issued its report in June 2010. And Prime Minister David Cameron at the time also issued a formal apology. But to this day, no ex-soldiers have been prosecuted, and it's unclear how the government, this recent offer of conditional amnesty, would affect the family's search for justice. So to tie this example to the problems of writing an official history, several questions that I would have is, how would the official history represent Bloody Sunday? Would the professional historians have the discretion and the independence to write about it fully or truthfully? Or, as some critics have raised, would there be some degree of political interference on the part of the UK government for the historians to create, a false sense of balance between the security forces and, say, the civil rights marchers? The Secretary of State claims that the historians would have full access to the official documentary record, but again, one questions what that record contains. Does it paint certain figures in an unduly favorable light? What does it omit? What is skewed? Would the historians have full access to it, or would parts of it still be classified because the subjects, the figures are still alive? And so to wrap this up, I think I ask, why is the government proposing such an official history now? And to me, it seems that it's doing so because such a project would enable the government to, draw a line under the past, to supposedly settle disputes, move on, to settle all claims about the past, and focus on other priorities. And so, as far as what it means for justice and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, it is quite troubling.
Thank you, Ryan. Of course, we always know that anything that happens in Ireland often has a spillover in the United States because of the strong Irish community in the US. And we'll have some questions, I believe, on that in a minute from the audience. But let me pick up then with some of your points about, it makes me wonder how different history would be written now, for example, with Ukraine. That it's in real time in a very powerful and often disturbing way, as Dr. Brown mentioned earlier. when social media or citizen journalists are covering these things, where there's no statute of limitations, where it's in real time. We've already seen a Russian soldier prosecuted, or more or less prosecuted, or sort of held accountable at least. So Casey, if I could turn to you now, Casey Donoghue, you've done a lot of research into Liberia, into remembrance of conflicts, how that is seen, youth history, the remembrance of the civil conflict there. Is it possible to kind of capture this sort of division and pursuit of peace in a time of conflict, given what you know from Liberia and elsewhere, Casey?
Yeah, Sarah, that's a really interesting question. You could take it from a few different ways. If we're talking about the pursuit of peace during war, during an unjust war, if we're talking about pursuing just a negative peace, the cessation of hostilities, then yeah, pursuing peace in a time of war does raise strategic and moral questions. By bringing certain actors to the table, are you undermining your chance to find justice after the violence stops? By enacting short ceasefires, are you, bettering or favoring the military positioning of one group? These are questions that have to go into the pursuit of a negative peace. But if I can expand your question into, I think what people would call sustainable peace, the creation of a society where people can live and remember together in a healthy processing way, well, then we see that there are, if not actions that can be taken now, then there are at least questions that can be asked now. And there are two recent articles that I really like that I think are examples of academia that can breed a bit of activism in eras of violence. And I'm by no means an expert or even horribly a specialist in Ukraine and Russia, so I will just project these questions onto it. But they derive from both the situations in Liberia and Northern Ireland. About a week ago, the political scientist Christopher Blattman published this really interesting report about him and his colleagues. About a few years ago, they did a randomized control test of about 1,000 Liberian men. They provided roughly $500 of 8 weeks of therapy and a small cash grant to these men, and they examined kind of how they went about the community afterwards. These were former combatants or violence or addiction affected young men. And they found that at the end of this trial, with this 8 weeks of therapy, they saw a 50% violent crime reduction in the randomized control test. Now, why am I interested in something like this as somebody who studies memory landscapes? Because when you look at the memory landscape of a place like Liberia, the memorialization of the civil conflict is really characterized by an absence of central state funding and support of monuments and community gatherings and methods of processing the trauma that happened between 1989 and 2003. And in my interviews with, a few dozen poets, writers, public intellectuals, history teachers, the private citizens who are interested in finding forms of collective remembrance often do so by starting at the level of sharing personal narratives. So here we see this direct, in the memory activism space of Liberia, in Monrovia and outside the capital, we see this direct link between what is basically therapy and systems of processing of violent conflict. So this is something, when I read this report by Blattman that I just cited, it makes me want to ask, okay, well, what would a post-Ukrainian society's capacity be to provide social services and therapy to its citizens? That's the question that comes to mind. And I ask that with humility as somebody who's trying to, apply different peace building initiatives across the world. In the Northern Irish space, are there lessons there? Queen's University in October last year came out with a really long report called It Didn't End in 1998, covering new perspectives on the transgenerational legacy of how the troubles are passed down to children, looking at how this affects not only the psychology of families, but also inter-community dynamics, political dynamics. Among many recommendations, they did call for a revision of historical curriculum in Northern Ireland to allow for students to more thoroughly engage in the conflict in different ways. when I read this report, I ask, okay, well, who are the main stakeholders in the Ukrainian and Russian spaces who run civics, social studies, and history curricula? So when we ask these sorts of questions and we look at sustainable peace building, the answer to your question, Sarah, is yes. Peace is something that you can build in the dark, and it should be pursued even when violence is going on. And I have to say, just to conclude that point, I'd be remiss if I didn't echo some of Brendan's skepticism about the transnational applicability of peace building initiatives. I, in Liberia, would advocate more state funding for sites of memory and monuments, but an influx of resources to other countries could result in the perpetuation of very toxic historical narratives. You know, if cross-community contact initiatives work and yield empathetic conversations between students in Belfast, they normalize systems of injustice in Israel and Palestine. So I'm trying to work through this, and hopefully these are some productive questions to pose, but I'm coming at all this with a real sense of humility about what these kinds of transnational conversations can yield.
Yes, that toxic narrative really played itself out in many African countries as well, as you saw with the lack of support for the UN resolution and the numbers of abstentions for that resolution. Although, of course, you know, a war like this in the 21st century in Europe is, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said, an absurdity. But I'm going to pick up, you've mentioned Dr. Brown's points, and I'm going to go back to him now. We've got a few questions coming in from the audience, which I'll pick up in a second. But you talk about the toxic narrative, Casey, and you know, I'm wondering, Brendan, to what extent this is changing with social media, where it's in real time, where people are able to report as witnesses, so that even once there is a peace agreement, and you know the ink is not dried on those agreements, almost never, because it always gets passed on, as Casey was saying, to a next generation. What happens to those left behind, the memories of those left behind? Is there some way of capturing that? Is social media enough? I'm throwing a lot at you again, I know, Brendan, but over to you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to discern exactly what the question is. I mean, certainly the issue of dealing with the past. I think that's the broad theme really that we're discussing here. I mean, I listened very intently to all the other contributors, and thank you very much for those. I mean, Northern Ireland has been dealing with the past since forever. You know, one of the longest standing non-governmental organizations in the north of Ireland was established in 1997, I believe, but just before the agreement. It received 6 months funding. It was an organization called Healing Through Remembering, and it still exists to this day. So that should be a very good indication as to how we have really struggled to deal with our past. Now, the other thing I would say is we kind of do it in an ad hoc way. So we don't need to be led by governments. I mean, governments, at the end of the day, you know, governments want to hide what they were involved in. I mean, the British government does not want the truth to be laid flat down at 10 Downing Street, because it would have to admit that it was absolutely up to its neck in collusion. It was absolutely involved in targeting civilians and facilitating the murder of innocent civilians as well. So they're going to do all they can to quash this. But in the absence of those type of formal top-down measures, we have a real vibrant grassroots dealing with the past civic space, which is fascinating. In terms of the social media question, could you reframe that a little bit, just if I can try and give you a decent answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did throw a lot into the sink there. And I think that the issue for me is I'm wondering to what extent issues of reporting and capturing memory has changed now in a time of conflict because of social media. Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, you saw that absolutely brutally recently, and like I mean, I'm referring to my own situation being here present in Palestine. I mean, the world saw in absolute abhorrent detail what happened to Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot, as I mentioned at the start of this discussion, and that those images were translated and brought around the world in almost real time. And we also saw the funeral being attacked as well. But it needs to be much more than that. It can't just be about sharing images and so that we commemorate and we think about people of the past. We need to use this energy around exposing what's happening and lobbying our governments who facilitate this type of thing, really. I mean, that at the end of the day, that's, if you want to talk about peace building, we need to be actively targeting those that are actually involved in warmongering. Let's be real. So that's
Brendan, what do you mean by targeting?
Whatever that action takes. I mean, if that requires us to be lobbying, it also, for me, it requires us to really be sensitive to our language, call things out for what it is, and not look to all sides every argument. At the end of the day, if it looks like colonialism, call it what it is, you know. And I think that's the problem. We have a lot of we allow political representatives to get away with language that just is completely unacceptable and wrong. So we can target that type of thing. We can target narrative. We can teach our children. I know children, young people is a theme that's come up. We can teach them properly about the past and the history without having to use sanitized language as well. And then there are other ways that we can target rogue regimes. I mean, the world has showed us all of a sudden that the language of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we're allowed to do that all of a sudden. But when it comes to targeting other rogue nation states with boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we're not allowed to do that. So, you know, maybe we need to look at some of these hypocrisies personally as well.
Right. As they say, history is often written by the victors. So it's about having a full perspective, isn't it? Let me ask Owen Cummings from the perspective of being in Belfast at a really crucial time now, given what happened with the elections, being on something of a knife edge. Are young people in Belfast looking at this toxic narrative that both Casey and Brendan have mentioned and looking at ways to change that in real time through social media, but beyond that as well? So it's not just that moment, but targeting the so-called toxic narrative?
I do think so. I think as well, like sort of to broaden it even a little bit, we've seen a lot of things since 2020 really is when I've seen it take off, is people internationally picking up on local issues, sort of, you know, seeing certain cases in America, for example, and you'll see it shared across Ireland, across Britain, across the entire world. And I think that a lot of people, when they saw that, they saw issues of colonialism in Africa. They saw the issues that colonialism has brought in Asia and right across the world. And people in Northern Ireland, they said to themselves, this looks very familiar to me, you know, because that is, of course, where the conflict really stems from. And I think that young people here are sort of changing their perspective on it a little bit. A lot of young people in my generation, yes, a lot of them were told this is the way you should think, but a lot of people were also given the space to freely judge it for themselves. And when they did that, they did take out the toxicity around it. And as well as Brendan mentioned, I think it was, about youth groups here in Northern Ireland, there's an amazing grassroots thing where it's not the government coming down. Government programs, which I have participated in myself, I have felt haven't addressed things as directly as the more grassroots ones, because grassroots organizations, they're not afraid to say, you know, think about, you know, was there state collusion? What do you think about that? You know, what is it that you want to see different? And I think that that's the real important thing, is as my generation have grown up, I know many people sort of in the years above me in school and whatnot are now going into grassroots things. They're creating their own organizations and they're trying to seek the truth. We talked about the British proposal to create a sort of definitive truth of the Troubles. A lot of people would say the people who know what the truth of the Troubles was the people who lived through it. You don't need a government to tell you what it is you lived through. And those grassroots organizations, I know I keep on saying grassroots, but you know, they are so important. They allow us to find out what the truth is from people who went through it. You can there's some organisations specifically in the work in West and East Belfast, and they work in both of those communities. So West Belfast would be mainly Catholic nationalist, East Belfast is mainly Protestant Unionist. And they come together and they let you talk to people who were maybe in a paramilitary, and you can see what their thinking was, and they will give you the insight into, I did that and it was wrong. And it's the merging of the young and the sort of older generations to take the toxicity out of it, because the older people don't want to return to what they went through. Younger people never want to have to go to that in the first place. And by taking that out of it, you do create a sort of a safer environment through which that can be discussed and through which memory can be explored in a way which isn't hurtful, but is used as a tool for education, really.
Thank you. And I'm getting a lot of bells ringing in the background, and we're also at the same time getting a number of questions coming in from the audience, and picking up on the question of apologies and also the issue of truth. Whose truth? In an age of misinformation, disinformation, whose truth are we really capturing? It's seen in the case of Russia and Ukraine. Two truths are emerging, and they don't, as we saw with Northern Ireland as well. Let me turn to Sarah from a Kenyan perspective, going back to the divisions that you had in 2007 with these tribal politics that created so much violence. Who would apologize for that period, and whose truth is it anyway?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, in the Kenyan perspective, I think I would call it like a problem that we have. We always have this selective amnesia. So during the election period is when you're aware of this conflict. Then after the election period, a year later, you completely forget until 4 years, 5 years later. And so because of this, it has become very difficult to tackle the cause of conflict in Kenya. People are aware that there's ethnic divisions, but it's kind of like underneath the ground during the if it's not an election year, it's like people are aware of it, but people don't feel it. Then during the election period is when then for some reason it just comes up. You kind of realize, oh, my neighbor is not my tribe, my friend is not from my tribe, and so kind of like and then when we are not in these election cycles, people completely forget, and people don't deal with the actual issue. And so for Kenya, I think to progress and to have like a more sustainable peace and to prevent the reoccurrence of conflict, we do need to deal with this specific issue of ethnicity and ethnic divisions and political violence from these ethnic divisions. And so when you speak about the truth, we actually, we did have a Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commission, and this was kind of created to facilitate the discussions on justice for those who have been harmed, either human rights violations or other sorts of injustices since independence, really. So it was from a period of independence in 1963 to around 2008 for those injustices that occurred during that period under various administrations. And there was a report that came from that, and it was submitted to the president, I think recently as, I think it was 2013 maybe. And it was also submitted to Parliament, but nothing really has been done about it. So we see there's a lot of, there's mini steps towards trying to fix issues, but they don't take it all the way. So there will be reparations for those who lost land or for those who lost their houses. They'll be given new housing or something. But those who suffered from other injustices, such as sexual violence or other forms of justice, never really get reparations for it. And then we also see there's a lot of semi-compliance. Even we saw Kenya was in the ICC for those who did some of the injustices in 2007, but then it kind of fell off the wagon. There was no justice there. No one was no one was was given any form of punishment. The witnesses somehow disappeared. And so there's steps towards justice, then there's somehow it disappears along the way. And so this is just, it has become a pattern, and then it has become a problem. And this kind of continuously fuels this conflict. So there was initial damage or initial injustices, then is then built upon more injustices going forward. And so I think to deal with these issues, we do need to be very factual of the situation that we have in the country, come openly talking about it. We do need to admit that we have, tribal issues, and we do need to talk more openly about it, talk about how can we fix this, how can we not vote according to our tribe, and not even openly talk about it. And I think there's been some steps, especially on the aspect of hate speech, and some of this hate speech is usually along tribal lines. So one politician will talk ill about another politician on the basis of hate speech. And so there's been some moves towards curtailing this hate speech, especially during this election cycle. And that has kind of helped in mitigating some of the incitement that would, then fuel the conflict. So we do have some steps we are making, but then we don't really actualize it to the end. So then it ends up just being a problem that we have kind of pushed forward in the future, which, for the youth who will, grow up to inherit this, administration, whatever, they'll kind of have this to deal with this problem in later end. So there's a need to kind of have a different way to fix it, I would say.
It sounds like I'm in a war zone at the moment with the helicopters overhead, but I assure you I'm not. It's just need to recognize that I'm battling over the sound. But I think that's a really important point that you brought up there, Sarah. It's about having the courage for a society to hold a mirror up to itself and not always look for the blame game, look at who is to blame for conflict or the lack of peace, and be honest enough to recognize the toxicity within its community and not look to blame someone. We've got Dan Kelly from New York City has asked a couple of different questions here. One, interestingly, on sanctions. Maybe I can turn to you, Ryan Connor. What do you think about sanctions? Do they work? Do apologies work? Ryan.
I'm a bit puzzled about sanctions in this particular context. Is the audience member wanting to know what other governments could do to change the UK government's approach to legacy?
So the actual question is, once peace has been achieved after a conflict, is the dividend piece created the same for all sides, or do some get left behind? We explored that a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think certainly some are left behind in any peace agreements, especially in the Northern Irish case. There, as I'm sure many of our audience members are very well aware, there are a number of both Republican and loyalist groups that have opposed the peace agreement from the start. But I think, as Owen was talking about earlier, and Brendan too, many of the local oral history initiatives that have been in place since the mid to late 1990s, and the efforts of say the Bloody Sunday Justice Campaign, they are critical in ensuring that people whose demands, priorities, etc., might not otherwise be considered by those negotiating peace agreements, and whatever compromises they have to make. Those types of local groups and international advocates as well are critical to ensuring that more, as many people as possible benefit from the dividends of a peace agreement.
Right, good point. Thank you. Casey, your thoughts on whether you think apologies or sanctions or reparations work? Well, maybe all three work, but some examples perhaps from the work you've done either in Liberia or ongoing. Casey.
Yeah, thank you. Sanctions, apologies, and reparations. I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to field that trident of a question. But let's start with reparations as like a material counterpart to the development of like a healthy national or intercommunity narrative, right? It's very easy to discuss. I'll use the United States. It's very easy to keep a copy of the 1619 Project on your bookside table, and it's very easy to, you know, make a Instagram post or something when there's a moment of racial injustice or a police shooting or something like that. And it is quite easy to perform an alliance with productive narratives that kind of call into question not only historical crimes and sins of, you know, the American nation building project, but also, you know, to embrace the way that don't just recognize, for example, that slavery happened, but it was an aberration. So let's please now focus on emancipation. Don't just acknowledge the continuing and lingering nature of the injustices that they produce into the present. So, you know, that's really what I focus on. And that does take a certain amount of kind of mental reframing and unforgetting and or reacquainting with what you previously maybe thought your nation's identity was. But all of that happens, you know, that's all great, but it has to have a material counterpart in a lot of ways. So the acknowledgement of a national atrocity is one thing. The move toward material reparations or the rearrangement of the unjust structures that crime you're acknowledging, you know, created, that's another thing. So my research in Liberia has shown that the reparations have not really happened, and a lot of the power brokers who were perpetuators in the Civil War era continue to hold positions of power. So here you have, as I was describing earlier, a memory landscape of individual actors who try to create forms of collective remembrance, but they do so without support of the state. You see that despite the vast economic differences between the United States and Liberia, you see a very similar landscape where efforts to actually make amends for the injustices of slavery and Jim Crow toward dispossessed persons and Black Americans are done on a private level of individual benevolent actors who have proper funding or the proper amount of money to set up a good memorial or a good program that supports underfunded communities or food deserts or what have you. The critical difference is whether you have a central state that's interested in those material things. So I think that is the best I could do on the issue of reparations and apologies. Sanctions, I think we're tiptoeing into some IR theory there. I'll maybe pass that to anybody else who wants to take a crack at that.
Good pass there, Casey. Sanctions have worked to some extent, as we saw in South Africa and Ukraine. It's interesting what you say about reparations, given the big New York Times story today on France and Haiti and how the Haitians were forced to pay back for their own freedom for so long. So that point of memory is very relevant to capturing memory. Final thoughts now, turning to Brendan for the last couple of minutes. Any closing remarks that you'd like to make, Brendan, from what you've heard, and anyone else who wants to jump in after that?
Oh, that's a privileged position to be given that space. I mean, thank you to everybody who's.
You won't be alone.
Okay, well, thank you for everyone for their comments. Just some very interesting points there, Casey, about the reparations at the end. I mean, I think also back of one of the proposed reparations or compensation payments that was for victims of the Troubles in the North here was that everybody would receive £12,000 if they were a victim of the conflict in the North. And even that was weaponized to the extent that we couldn't agree on who was a legitimate or non-legitimate victim. So, I mean, reparations very much also leaves people out in that sense. And I think you spotlighted that beautifully. I mean, I guess I just return to my original point at the very beginning here. And I think we need to very much be careful with our language when we describe what's going on. We need to not be so blind to other circumstances and situations that are happening, and we should challenge at all opportunities. hypocrisy that is promoted. I mean, we're obviously all here very interested in peace building, and I wouldn't want you to think that I'm not interested in peace building. I am absolutely interested in peace building, but it's because I see how badly it has been weaponized in spaces like Palestine that I'm so committed to calling out this what I consider to be pretty limited language at times. So thank you for having me on, Sarah, and thanks for your questions and everybody else.
Thank you, Brendan. Sarah, your final thoughts, anything to add on issues around reparations and memory?
Yeah, thank you. Regarding reparations and memory, I think what I can add is that the peace process is, as it says, it's a process. So it's not a one-time single event at a specific, timeline. It's a process, and people or countries and communities need to view it as such. Even when we relate it to peace agreements, it should be seen as the entry point or the pathway towards like a more sustainable peace. And reparations and dialogue and mediation and all these other things that go within peace building should be seen as this spectrum within people and communities that they need to go through to get to this this sustainable peace that they want to achieve. So I think that is what I can emphasize the most, that when we look at peace agreements, it should be seen as a process towards peace and not just like a one-off thing that, once we've signed it, then, guaranteed peace.
I think that's the best way to end it, that the evolution and the pursuit of peace, the value of peace, it's shifting landscapes, isn't it? That's the whole theme of these 3 days of conference at the New York Irish Center, and it's a brilliant way to end it. It's an evolution, and the ink is never dried on a peace process, it would seem. So I think that will bring to an end now a very rich conversation. It's just the beginning, just like the peace process, it never ends. So thank you all to the wonderful panelists that we've had on today. And please join us tomorrow at the same time, that is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. Where I am in the world, it's 7 p.m. And wherever you are, you'll work out from the links to the New York Irish Center, or indeed on Irish Central. America-Ireland Youth Conference, Day 3, the final day. We'll be tackling climate change together, moderated by Claire Byrne, with another very impressive lineup of young panelists. So that's it from me. Goodbye, and goodbye to all the panelists, and thank you.